So this is all the food that we will be distributing to our employees, our Casa Amor employees. Fruits and vegetables. Pretty eerie. This restaurant's usually full by this time. There's nobody here. All of our employees are gone. There's no guests, no live music, nobody.
We received a mandate from Governor Sisolak here in Nevada that all non-essential businesses needed to close down, and then I sent out a mass text to all the employees.
I cried.
Yeah, it was a hard thing to do.
It's our family that we're losing.
We were in the restaurant for 15 years. We did run into some hardship as far as, there was a recession in 2008. So even though we faced a recession back then, we really didn't feel the brunt of it. So this is really our first time facing something that's a real challenge.
So here's everything. Empty restaurant, just waiting for our employees to come in to give them all this food.
What we're doing is we're giving out all our perishable food to our employees to take home to their families.
This is our small business, and so you're so close with your employees. It is family. So it's sad. You're not getting to see them. You're worried for them. They have families. We have families. We all have families. So it's very scary. I feel very vulnerable.
Just kind of grabbing a little bit of things.
At first, naturally, I felt upset because it's like my job and I don't really have anything else to do or anywhere else to go. Where I've thought about maybe applying at a Walmart, because I know now grocery stores are mainly staying open. A lot of people are panic buying, a lot of people are touching things, so it's what would be worse, staying at home or trying to get some income.
I don't want to touch that.
At my house, we have me, my mom, my 2 little brothers, my dad, and my uncle. Me and my mom and my uncle are the ones who normally bring in the money to the household. Me and my mom work here at Casa, and then my uncle works at Olive Garden, which was also shut down the same day. So as of right now, there's no one working at home. We're all shut down. Now we're preoccupied about how we're going to pay the rent. And yeah, we do have some stuff saved up, but it only lasts. Some money saved up, but it won't last for long.
Within a week, it's gone from one sports league canceling to now the whole country's pretty much closed down. With 9/11, you knew after a while it would come back. But with this, it doesn't look like anybody really knows a date.
Seeing it like this kind of makes me, don't cry.
Oh.
It makes me want to, it makes me want to cry because we showed up and everyone's one of my coworkers wearing a mask and gloves and everything because everyone's afraid to touch anything. So it's seeing it like this. It's kind of seeing your home being ripped apart.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.